Good morning, class. Thank you so much for your kindness last week when I needed to focus on my mom and moving her and helping her learn how to answer video calls. She did it twice this week, so we're hoping her memory holds so that I can stay in touch with her and my brother can see her as they continue to keep them pretty isolated these days. So I'm really grateful. Thank you. Sorry for being late in posting this. I shifted what I was going to post this week to help us get ready for our next conversation together when we talk particularly about the way that these things that we do together, these Christian practices that are God's gift to us to help reorder our desires and reform us into the image of Christ, both individually and, more importantly, in my view, collectively, as the body of Christ, how they can also deform us. So I'm going to talk a lot today from the work of Lauren Winner, and we'll see how Lauren can help us. In her book, and a couple of you said you had read it already, let me just summarize much of what she says. In her book, The Dangers of Christian Practice, she argues that when a practice goes wrong, it's not just because the people did it wrong, that there's something inherent in the practice that has to be attended to. Her basic assumptions are these: that Christian practices are damaged by sin because everything that is a part of the world in which we live and breathe and move are damaged by sin, by the ways that our own desires, our own devices, our own limitations keep us from the fullness of God's intent. She talks about sin as denoting habits, actions, and the proclivities of human beings that draw what God created away from God and unleash damage in the world. And I think the most important part of this book for me is to serve as a cautionary tale for any of us who invite others to join us in Christian practices, to ask the question and look forward of what are the unintended consequences that we might think about down the road. How might this go wrong? Knowing that there's so many ways in which anything, a new program or any new gathering form, down the road we'll look back and go, gosh, we didn't see that coming. So we can't know all things. We're limited. That's part of our humanness and some of the ways in which we are created with vision but with limitation. But to know before we go willy-nilly and invite people into new ways and new forms, to think about what habits are we asking for people to incorporate into their lives, and what things are we asking people to do together, and how might those form and reform, and as much as we can possibly imagine and do some forward thinking on, how can we help those not be deformative? And when they have been, how can we be honest about it and pull up our socks and seek to fully do things anew with God's help? So I've already mentioned that Winner's fundamental reminder is that Christian practices in and of themselves cannot save us, and that while they're goods, that they are not the bullet. If we just get everyone to do contemplative prayer, or everyone to pray with the Book of Common Prayer or Common Prayer for Radicals, that somehow we will become fully Christian by that practice. No, those things can help us, and thanks be to God for them. But only God can put together the pieces, and there is no one recipe for how that happens. This art form that was mentioned on the previous page, Japanese art form of, Kichigori? I don't know if I didn't say it right. But it's taking something broken and using sort of a gold mold and a gold molten glue, putting things back together again. So as I talk a little bit farther, keep this image in mind. God has called us to belong to God, to belong to one another, and to be stewards of this good earth, and that we mess that up. But there is this gold, this refined, molten goodness of God that can repair all things. So for us to be humble and recognize that our perceptions are faulty, however we go forward as leadership, we'll do so with discernment, but we won't do all things well. But we can be alert and learn how to respond to this sort of characteristic damage, this stuff that's baked in to our institutions, into our programs, into our families, and into our lives. And when we see something, to trust that with God's golden goodness, that things that have become broken can be made new again. A quick example, what does she mean without going into the practices, which we'll do next? She'll say that any human habit, any human gathering, any human practice or habit does something, right? Like a meal. We eat them all the time. What does a meal do? She says that a meal is a ritualized and regulated social act in which the actors consume food. It's a rather academic notion, but yeah, we eat, and we often eat at a table or around a coffee table or outdoors at a picnic table. It's ritualized. We know when we sit down to pick up a fork, to take a plate if we're here in the U.S., or if we are somewhere else, we recognize now we sanitize our hands and we do all sorts of other ritualized actions before we eat together. What does a meal do? And this is what the question we need to ask of all the practices. What does it do, and what are the possible unintended deformations? A meal provides potential goods. We need food. It slows us down and allows us to be close enough that we can look in each other's eyes and hear each other's voices and to check in through the day. And we all know that families that are strong, one of the things that all research says is if people spend time together over food, talking about their days, talking about their hopes, dreams, wishes, that creates a strength of commitment and tie and helps all the individuals feel stronger about who they are. But of course, a family meal can be deformed by the nature of the size of a table. Some can attend and some cannot. There will be those that don't know how to act at the table. And so tables can also become places of social control, greed, and hierarchy. I paid attention to this as I've learned so much when I go outside of my own culture. I was in Uganda, gosh, it must be about 10 years ago, doing a women's conference. And as we talked about health and nutrition, and we talked about the needs of women, particularly those who are nursing or pregnant, how they need protein to help build those babies with those strong amino acids. And everyone afterwards, when we got into small groups, the leaders came up to us afterwards and said, but that doesn't work here. If there's a chicken, the majority of the chicken goes to the men, and then it goes to the boys, and then it might go to the girls, and then the moms get it last, even the lactating moms. And so we began to recognize that this family meal practice, not because anyone was intending to exclude or leave out, but because of the social norms, that some of the basics of what a meal should provide, particularly for those who are engaged in, growing young life, that it had to become twisted, deformed. And as new information comes, you learn more, we rethink what happens at a family meal. How do we make sure that everyone gets not only what they need, but that we share in the ways that lead to fullness of human flourishing? Okay. In this book, and I'm going to go through very quickly, I'll post this so you can look back on it if you want to review the notes. Lauren Winner goes through 3 very specific Christian practices and gives some historical analysis, rather wonky academic historical analysis. I like it a lot, but she brings her very interesting gifts together to examine something to make the point, which I hope will be well taken. The first practice she looks at is at the Eucharist. And she says at the very beginning, if you remember that the very first time we have this biblical example of Christian Eucharist, the breaking of the bread, the sharing of the wine, that Judas dutifully took from Jesus himself and immediately went out to betray Jesus. So there is no sort of magic in the meal in this instance. There is no way that just taking the meal itself will make all things new. That doesn't mean, of course, that this is not one of those essential means of grace, but to say that in the very meal itself, in the very vulnerability of the gift, in the practice of trusting someone with the broken body and the spilled out blood, that what the person will take from that and do with it is not prescribed nor guaranteed. The historical lesson that she gives is from the 13th century or so in Europe, where those that were being brought into the body of Christ in a time of economic and political upheaval would take the bread as sort of fuel, if you will, to go out then and to destroy the homes and kill the Jews in the neighborhood, and then to make it all better by putting a chapel often on top of those communities or in the center of those communities that were the pogroms began to take place. And it was this fear of the other becomes justified by Christian practice. We're the right ones, we're the good ones, we're the righteous ones. And Jesus becomes justification to do harm to neighbor rather than love neighbor. And of course, this raises all sorts of questions for us. Who's inside? Who's outside? What does the grace of God that is given to us in the Eucharist, how does that form us for life in the world? Of course, Jesus's body was a Jewish body, and he was raised in a Jewish home. He was the King of the Jews. How then can participating in the body and blood of this Jesus the Jew, the Messiah, the one who opened the doors to us who are Gentiles, how can that body and blood of Christ be used to do harm to the other, in this case, particularly the Jews? We could drill down in this and think hard about how does our Christian practice insulate any of us in our social location, our social identification, and allow us then to do harm to the others or disregard the other who doesn't participate in our practice, and even do violence to them because somehow they're outside the family, and this bread and cup becomes, rather than a means of grace to call us to deeper love, to more humble engagement, it creates this kind of crusade, if you will, to use intentional language. That means all must be destroyed who are not within the bounds of our understanding of Christian practice.